So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this roundtable on soft law and nudge regulation in international law. First of all, let me say that I'm honored. I'm honored to introduce this opening section of an event of utmost importance, such as the San Ginesio meeting, doctoral meeting. And I'm really delighted to introduce this discussion on soft law and nudge regulation in front of a wide group of young and promising scholars of international law, and next to two prominent distinguished scholars, Professor Jean d'Aspremont, Professor of International Law at the University Sciences-Po, Paris, and at the same time at the Professor of International Law also at the University of Manchester, and Professor Giovanni Tuzet, who is Professor of Philosophy of Law at the Bocconi University of Milan. For this reason, let me say once again thank you to Professor Pasquale De Sena, to Professor Giovanni Zarra, and to all the members of the directing board of the SIDI, and to the International Center for the Gentilinian Studies for this organization. Thank you. So we are going to discuss a very fascinating but also complex topic. For this reason, I thought to prepare a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not very used to this instrument, but I think this time can be useful for you to follow me and for me to try to be as clear as I can. So we can start our discussion from the title of this roundtable, Soft Law and Nudge Regulation in International Law. The title embodies and indices with two elements. The first element, soft law, in the eyes of internationalists, is much more common, is a much more straightforward concept, which includes all forms of non-binding law. On the contrary, the concept of nudge is much more mysterious, new, and controversial. For this reason, I think the best thing is to start with the concept of nudge, then to move to the concept of international nudge, so the application of that nudge in international law, and then to come back to the question of the relationship between soft law and nudge, or better, between law in general and nudge. So, sorry. Okay. The definition of nudge. Nudge is, yes, it is here, okay. Nudge is an approach to regulation which is behaviorally informed and is choice preserving. So it's behaviorally informed modes of regulation that influence people's decisions without limiting their choice set, okay? According to the main theories of nudge, which are Richard Taylor and Cass Stein, nudge suggests to guide, to promote the behaviors of states, but without binding them. So letting them the choice to choose another way. And the basic idea is to take advantage of the results of the cognitive behavioral studies, which have made a lot of cognitive mistakes, cognitive bias. They are victims of imperfections. A typical example of imperfection is the so-called default effect. So people tend to stick on the default solution, or default choice, and they tend not to change the default setting. For this reason, the nudge approach may be considered a functionalist approach to regulation, in the sense that it assumes that regulators can design the choice architecture, so the decision-making environment, in order to induce people to make the decision that the regulators want to promote, and they think that is the best solution for individuals, but without obliging them, so letting them the possibility to change. Let me give you a typical example of nudge. Organ donation. If we assume that organ donation is the best choice for all, nudge approach to regulation suggests to frame the rule, to formulate the rule in a way to put organ donation as the default solution and to require people to express their intention to refuse donation if they want to refuse donation. In this way, we can maximize the opportunity that people accord their consent, that people accept organ donation. Well, nudge is spreading, is gaining success in the United States, in Europe. At the same time, is also attracting a lot of controversy, a lot of criticism. Try to go on. Here, I beg your pardon if I have to oversimplify some concepts that can be discussed better later. The arguments of criticism are many. There are different arguments of criticism, but I think there are two main lines of criticism. Nudge against individual autonomy. The other one is nudge against the values of democracy. Sorry. Well, about nudge against individual autonomy. Nudge raised the suspect that people may be manipulated. It reduces the individual autonomy of people in making their choices, in this respect of the values of human dignity and of identity and the uniqueness of individuals. However, those that defend nudge from this criticism argue that some nudge have informative content only. So in this sense, they may help people to make more informed decisions. So they may raise individual autonomy. So it depends on how nudge is conceived and construed to its relationship with autonomy. And on the other side, there are some that stress that the very concept of human dignity is wide, complex. For example, if we think about advertising campaigns against, for example, smoking or against obesity, sometimes they use shocking images, shocking messages that can shock people, that can also humiliate the individual sensitiveness, even if they pursue a good goal, such as preventing diets, preventing people from smoking, saving lives. The problem is, who can judge what is the better choice for an individual? The problem is that not always the general interest coincides with the individual interests, in the sense that sometimes individual interests and general interests may go in different ways, or even if they go in the same ways, but the perception that one person has of its own interest may be different from the general view, from the mainstream view. We can come back later to this argument of criticism. The other line of criticism, here I try to, okay, nudge against democracy. Nudge also raised and has raised suspects about transparency and democracy. It raises transparency concerns because not always public officials discover the promotional intent behind a rule. So nudge are less visible than obligations, are less clear than obligation. And in this sense, they tend to escape public scrutiny. But even when public officials disclose the promotional intent of a nudge, doubts may arise about the legitimacy of the assumptions underlying a nudge, in the sense that if all of us are victims of cognitive bias, also regulators are victims of cognitive bias, or maybe of informative shortages, of other kind of imperfections. So how can we defend ourselves from the bias of the regulators? This is a big question that remains. And also the question that I anticipated before, the contradiction between individuals and general interest. So this again, there is a lot of room for discussion. But let's move to the concept of international judge. No. Sorry. Doesn't work. Okay. Okay, the concept of international judge. Now we can resume the old definition of nudge and change the word individuals with the word of states and see if it works. So we can assume that international judge refers to behavior-informed modes of regulation that influence states' behavior without limiting their choice set. So a nudge approach may promote states' behavior to induce them to make the preferable choice without binding them. So the question is if nudge is a good alternative, an alternative to bindness, maybe an alternative to bindness, and a way to overcome the state's reluctances to accept obligations that they are not prepared to accept. And here it lies the relationship between nudge and soft law. However, I think that the relationship between nudge and soft law and nudge law in general is more complex. And I want to try to express this concept and clarify this concept by giving you some examples of international nudge. There are 3 examples of international nudge that I want to discuss very briefly. The first one, well, I've taken these 3 examples from Teichmann and Zamir, who are 2 internationalists that have studied the topic of nudge and have published their research results on the European Journal of International Law last year. And they propose 3 examples. The first example of international nudge may be opting out arrangements in multilateral treaties. For example, arbitration clauses on jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. Here, there is an interesting research conducted by Galbraith that has compared a large number of multilateral treaties containing a jurisdiction clause, containing differently framed, differently formulated jurisdiction clause. Some are opting in jurisdiction clause, in the sense that they ask states to express their acceptance to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. Others are expressed opting out jurisdiction clause, and others are implied opting out jurisdiction clauses. So this research shows that in the first case, in the case of opting in jurisdiction clause, very few states have accepted the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice. Very, very few. In the second case, the case of express opting out clauses, 80% of states have accepted the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice. In the third case, implied opting out jurisdiction clauses, very, very few states have opted out from the jurisdiction of the court. So most states have accepted the jurisdiction of the court. So this research seems to demonstrate that states are victims, like individuals, of similar cognitive bias, or are indirectly reached by cognitive bias of individuals, and so they react seemingly. And for example, they are victim of the default effect, so they tend to stick to the default arrangements of the rule. However, about the relationship between this kind of nudge and the law. In this case, the effect of nudge is to promote state consent to international obligations. So I think that in this case, nudge is conducive to hard law, because nudge in this case is embodied in an international legal instrument. And even if it is a mechanism that leaves a margin of choice, this margin of choice may be conducive to hard law and may be considered in line with the goals of international law. If we move to the second example of international nudge instead, the relationship between international law and nudge becomes a little bit more complicated. I'm referring to goal setting. The goal setting indicates the tendency to use non-binding goals, to include non-binding goals in soft law international instruments. For example, the UN Millennium Development Goals. Well, there are certain studies that have emphasized that these non-binding goals are very effective to promote certain good behavior of states, in the sense that even if they're not binding, states tend to comply to this objective. And some targets of the UN Millennium Development Goals that were meant to be reached by the 2015 actually have been not reached, but there has been significant progress toward the target compliance. So even in this case, there are studies that demonstrate that states are victim of the motivation effect of non-binding goals, which is another kind of cognitive bias that, according to the behavioral studies, hit individuals, and they maybe affect also states. However, in this case, the effect in terms of relationship between nudge and soft law and between nudge and law is different, because here the effect of nudge is to replace hard law with soft law. Here we make a step outside of the field of international law, and we are more in the realm of international policy, and of course with all the consequences of this change, in the sense of lack of judicial remedies, lack of mechanism of verification of compliance. The third example, however, is the most controversial one, I think, and it is rankings. It refers to rankings. Here the reference is to the tendency to use rankings to measure states' performance. International organizations, but also non-governmental organizations and other governance entities, various governance entities, tend to use to establish benchmarks, standards that are used to measure states' compliance, state performance in different fields of international relations. And they take advantage of another cognitive bias, which is the motivation effect of social comparison. Behavioral studies, in fact, have demonstrated that people are very reactive and sensitive to social comparison. And so this kind of rankings promote states' behavior and attract states' compliance to this benchmark, even if these benchmarks are not binding. I mean, they are not obliged to, but they tend to, because they want, of course, they are in competition with other states, they want to show that they are compliant, that they reach a higher position. So, again, there are studies that demonstrate that these rankings may be effective. Here I made the example of the OECD index that measures law restrictions on foreign direct investment across almost 70 states, but there are many others mechanisms like this one. There are also commentators that have showed and have commented that the risk of rankings is to oversimplify and to choose in a partial and instrumental way the benchmark. In this regard of national preferences, national diversities, and also in this regard and in this respect of the heterogeneity of states models. And also there is the risk of creating hierarchies among states, and so presenting such states as better than others on the basis of debatable benchmarks or debatable framed benchmarks and standards. In this case, the effect of nudge is not only to escape from international law, I mean to move away from the realm of international law to that of international, we are more in the field of international governance. But the problem is also that in this case, nudging may also contradict some basic values of international law, such as the value of equality of states, such as the value of respect for domestic affairs of states, especially when benchmarks and requirements are employed as conditions to apply for loans or to get to take advantage of other forms of international assistance. So in this case, a risk of violation of equality and discrimination arises. So we can come back to these questions and arguments during the discussion. I don't want to steal too much time, but I want to finish the introduction by setting the table for discussion by putting some questions on the table. Okay, here, oh, sorry. No. Sorry, I pressed the button, but it doesn't work. And I don't know how to resume the, okay, here it is, it's the last one, so. So what are the pros and cons of nudge in international law? Of course, we can keep on debating on these basic questions, pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages of using nudge, of nudging people, of nudging states. But also, what is the very purpose of nudge? Why do we need nudge? For me, it is not entirely clear if nudge is meant to be a recipe of freedom and an alternative to blindness, or instead a way to reach blindness by stressing the will of individuals or the states, but without assuming the accountability and responsibility costs and effects of this strategy, of this choice. So I want to leave you with this question, and I hope that we can come back later to discuss this point. What is the purpose of nudge? What is the effect of nudge? What is the relationship between nudge, not only between nudge and soft law, but between nudge and law in general, and freedom, for example? Is a way to improve freedom, or is a way to reduce freedom? There is a very wide margin of ambiguity in this new approach to regulation, in my view. But I'm very happy to let the floor to our distinguished guests to discuss and delve into these issues. So I'm going to leave the floor first to Professor Giovanni Tuzet to continue the discussion. So thank you. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks for the introduction. I was asked to make the presentation in Italian, and I have some slides in Italian. So if you don't mind, I will just use Italian. Ok. Un'altra cosa che vi chiederei è se posso stare in piedi. In questo caso forse dovrò usare quel microfono là. Ok, se funziona. No, se posso sto volentieri in piedi. Ok, allora grazie di nuovo a tutte e a tutti per questo incontro, agli organizzatori in particolare, a chi si è speso per questa bellissima iniziativa a cui sono felice di partecipare. Sono un filosofo del diritto, quindi farò solo qualche riferimento a possibili applicazioni delle tecniche di nudging al diritto internazionale, lasciando poi la parola su questo a chi è certamente più competente di me. Quello che farò essenzialmente è mostrarvi da dove viene l'idea di usare delle tecniche che chiamiamo nudges, quali sono dunque le assunzioni che queste tecniche hanno, su cui diciamo fanno leva, e questo ci consentirà anche di capire se effettivamente si possano in modo fruttuoso applicare queste tecniche nell'ambito del diritto internazionale e se ci siano appunto dei margini di utile impiego di queste tecniche nell'ambito del diritto internazionale. Non mi occuperò tendenzialmente delle obiezioni, diciamo, di tipo normativo, cioè se il nudging sia una maniera in realtà di limitare l'autonomia, se il nudging vada contro i principi di trasparenza, democrazia, cose a cui hai accennato prima. Lascerei queste cose per Jean o per la discussione, diciamo, conclusiva. Allora, un autore che voglio menzionare per ricordarvi da dove viene questa idea è Kahneman, che come sapete è stato anche insignito del premio Nobel per l'economia e che ha pubblicato nel 2011 un libro che ha avuto un successo formidabile, che è Thinking Fast and Slow. Un libro in cui Kahneman in realtà riassume decenni di studi empirici fatti da molte persone, lui in particolare, assieme in molti casi a un collega scomparso prematuramente che era Amos Tversky, con cui Kahneman ha pubblicato molti studi dagli anni 70 in poi. Studi che sono stati chiamati studi di economia comportamentale. No? L'approccio comportamentale nasce sostanzialmente da studi di Kahneman e Tversky. Okay? Cosa dice Kahneman, scusate, nel 2011, nel libro del 2011? In sostanza, sistematizzando tutti gli studi precedenti di tipo comportamentale, Kahneman dice: possiamo categorizzare la nostra razionalità come costituita da due sistemi, che chiamo semplicemente sistema 1 e sistema 2, e questa maniera semplice di individuarli ha contribuito al successo del libro e dell'opera. Ci sono due sistemi cognitivi che chiamiamo 1 e 2, dove la differenza sta in questo. Il sistema 1 è veloce, automatico, emozionale, intuitivo. Kahneman lo chiama human perché è, diciamo, quello più distintivamente umano, è la maniera, diciamo, basica in cui gli esseri umani reagiscono all'informazione. E abbiamo un sistema 2 che invece è caratterizzato da lentezza, riflessività, è la maniera che noi usiamo di prendere decisioni in base a calcoli, è il sistema che elabora dei piani e li segue monitorando la loro esecuzione puntuale. Okay? Secondo Kahneman e altri, questi due sistemi hanno anche delle basi neurologiche, cioè nelle nostre configurazioni neuronali possiamo individuare, diciamo così, delle zone in cui opera il sistema 1 e delle zone in cui opera prevalentemente il sistema 2. Quindi c'è anche una sorta di articolazione a livello neurologico, ma non prendete queste cose troppo alla lettera, nel senso che, come Kahneman stesso chiarisce, questi sono, se volete, dei modelli, delle semplificazioni dei nostri modi di trattare le informazioni, quindi diciamo sono un modo di presentare delle tendenze che noi abbiamo nel trattare le informazioni e formulare giudizi e assumere decisioni. Ognuno di noi, secondo Kahneman, è in sostanza caratterizzato da questi due sistemi. Dopodiché c'è chi è maggiormente incline a usare il sistema 1, c'è chi è maggiormente incline a usare il sistema 2, però entrambi i sistemi operano in noi, in qualche modo. No? Questa configurazione teorica di Kahneman, come vi dicevo, viene da decenni di studi empirici, condotti in particolare da lui e da Tversky, che erano stati chiamati studi, diciamo, sulle nostre euristiche e i biases che abbiamo nel formulare giudizi e prendere decisioni. Heuristics and Biases Theory è il nome con cui, diciamo, queste ricerche sono state divulgate. Heuristics and biases sono caratteri tipici in realtà del sistema 1. Sono modalità che ha il sistema 1 di trattare informazioni, formulare giudizi e assumere decisioni. Il sistema 2, che è quello più logico, diciamo così, non è affetto da biases e da heuristics. Quindi questi fenomeni riguardano il sistema 1. E vi faccio un paio di esempi per mostrare questo genere di cose. Forse qualcuno conosce già questi esempi che sono piuttosto noti nella letteratura. Allora, questo esempio viene da uno studio degli anni 70, quindi è pre-Covid, però suona in maniera abbastanza, diciamo, sinistra una volta, diciamo, passata l'esperienza che abbiamo tutti della pandemia. Allora, questo esperimento è consistito nel porre questo problema a un numero piuttosto ampio di soggetti dell'esperimento, in cui si chiede questo: dovete scegliere fra programmi sanitari alternativi per debellare una patologia, la famosa malattia asiatica, la chiamavano Kahneman e Tversky, che altrimenti annienterebbe l'intera popolazione di una comunità di 600 persone. Okay? Avete due possibilità per combattere la malattia asiatica. C'è un programma sanitario A che salva con certezza 200 vite. Seconda possibilità, programma sanitario B che comporta la probabilità di 1/3 di salvare tutte le 600 vite della comunità, 600 persone, e 2/3 di non salvare nessuno. Quale scegliete? Due, cioè B. Sarei curioso di sapere perché, ma prima di sentirlo volevo vedere se c'erano altre. B, di nuovo. Tutti scelgono B? No, A, per carità. La professoressa sceglie A. Qualcuno si sente di dire perché? Rapidamente, poi passiamo oltre. Prego. Allora, in entrambi gli scenari non sappiamo chi saranno i sommersi e i salvati, cioè anche nel primo caso sappiamo che 200 sopravvivranno, ma non sappiamo quali saranno. È un po' artificiale, ovviamente, come esperimento. L'idea è misurare le reazioni delle persone a questo tipo di problema. Quindi l'esperimento è stato fatto registrando per ciascuna persona qual è la scelta, dopodiché è stato posto un secondo problema che è leggermente diverso dal primo. Malattia asiatica 2, stessa storia, scegliete fra programmi sanitari bla bla bla, e le due opzioni sono: programma A comporta la morte certa di 400 persone, programma B comporta la probabilità di 2/3 di perdere tutte le 600 persone, 1/3 che nessuno morirà. Quale scegliete? Allora, voi che siete animati dal sistema 2, capite, c'è un trucco qui, no? In realtà è la stessa cosa di prima, presentata diversamente, ok? Chi è, diciamo, attento nota che qui c'è una formulazione diversa dello stesso problema, ok? Però gli studi sperimentali che sono stati fatti mostrano che una consistente percentuale dei soggetti degli esperimenti non nota queste cose. E la spiegazione è: perché le persone non la notano? Perché molte persone non la notano? Perché sono animate dal sistema 1 in sostanza. Il sistema 1 è quello veloce, intuitivo, eccetera, eccetera. Quindi quando il sistema 1 vede, qui la prima opzione A comporta la morte di 400 persone, ma no, non voglio fare questa cosa. No? Se invece dici al sistema 1 salvi con certezza 200 persone, ok, questo è forte, questo va bene, no? Però farne morire 400 insomma, non suona così bene. No? E in realtà è solo una maniera diversa di formulare il problema. Okay? Quindi la divergenza negli esperimenti, nei risultati degli esperimenti, fra chi in questo scenario dice A e stessa persona quando viene posto di fronte a questa scelta dice B, mostra una qualche forma di irrazionalità, che la persona in realtà con il proprio sistema 2 dovrebbe dire: no, attenzione, questa è la stessa cosa, quindi se scelgo A nel primo scenario, razionalmente devo scegliere A anche nel secondo, o se scelgo B, come diceva qualcuno, nel primo scenario, razionalmente devo scegliere B anche nel secondo. È incoerente scegliere A da una parte e scegliere B dall'altra. Perché siamo in una certa misura fatti così? La spiegazione è perché il sistema 1 agisce in modo tale da indurci in questo tipo di errore. Ma non è finita la storia. Se qualcuno di voi ha un po' di dimestichezza con le teorie della scelta razionale, le teorie economiche della scelta, vedrà che A e B, in entrambi gli scenari, hanno la stessa utilità attesa. Quindi è duplice il trucco qui, non solo c'è la differenza fra morte e vita, per come il problema è presentato, ma il valore atteso delle opzioni è lo stesso. Se noi attribuiamo, diciamo, il valore di 1 a ciascuna vita umana, abbiamo in ogni caso un valore atteso di 200, che è la vita di 200 persone, 200 per 1, più 400 per 0, perché 400 muoiono, e dall'altra parte abbiamo 1/3 di salvare 600, dunque abbiamo 200, più 0 per 2/3. Quindi 200 è il valore atteso di tutte queste opzioni. Quindi l'individuo sommamente razionale, dominato dal sistema 2, che è quello che calcola, ragiona, eccetera, dovrebbe dire: ehi, queste cose sono perfettamente equivalenti dal punto di vista della scelta razionale, tutte queste cose sono equivalenti, quindi come agente economico razionale io dico sono indifferente perché i risultati attesi sono gli stessi. Ci sono dei punti critici dell'esperimento, non mi soffermo su questo, se volete ne parliamo nel seguito. Però la morale che molti traggono da questo è, vedete, qui il sistema 1 in qualche modo domina il sistema 2, cioè la nostra reazione intuitiva, emozionale a questo genere di domanda supera la nostra capacità di calcolo, di riflessione attenta. E c'è anche il ruolo delle emozioni, fra cui paura, panico, fiducia, eccetera. Tecnicamente questo viene chiamato effetto framing, cioè come è presentato il problema genera una risposta diversa nei soggetti che devono prendere una decisione. Secondo esperimento molto rapido che vi mostro, sempre fatto da Kahneman e Tversky, dovete rispondere in 5 secondi a questa domanda. Qual è il risultato della moltiplicazione? Non lo facciamo qui, però negli studi viene fatto, viene chiesto alle persone in 5 secondi di scrivere un numero, ok? Poi alle stesse persone viene chiesto questo, serie discendente, rispondere in 5 secondi a questa moltiplicazione. Stessa cosa di nuovo, no? Notate, qui c'è la serie ascendente, qui c'è la serie discendente. Cosa interessante è che le persone rispondono però diversamente, cioè sistematicamente c'è un bias qui. Il risultato dovrebbe essere lo stesso, però la stima mediana dei soggetti a cui viene sottoposto la domanda, con la serie ascendente è 512. Quando invece ti viene sottoposta la serie discendente, la stima mediana delle persone è 2250. E i numeri sono gli stessi, ok? E la risposta corretta, peraltro, è 40.320. Quindi entrambe, diciamo, le risposte mediane sono sbagliate, ma l'una è molto più sbagliata, è più sbagliata dell'altra. Perché? Risposta di Kahneman e degli altri, beh, qui c'è un effetto che chiamano anchoring, un effetto di ancoraggio. Il nostro sistema 1, di nuovo, si aggancia, si ancora alle prime cifre. Quando mi viene data la serie ascendente, io comincio a ragionare, beh, 1 per 2 per 3, mi faccio una vaga idea, poi in 5 secondi non riesco a calcolare tutto correttamente, ma provo a fare un aggiustamento a spanne e do un certo risultato. Quando faccio la stessa cosa partendo dall'8, il mio sistema 1 mi fa immaginare una cifra più grande, perché il numero con cui inizia è più grande di quelli successivi. Okay? E questo spiegherebbe perché ci sia una differenza nelle risposte. No? Quindi se le cifre che inizialmente vengono date sono degli indicatori attendibili del risultato, l'ancoraggio qui funziona come una buona euristica, dove l'idea dell'euristica è l'idea di una qualche, diciamo, di una qualche strategia che ci aiuta a individuare un risultato corretto in certe occasioni, ma può fallire in altre. In questo caso fallisce, perché in realtà i numeri sono gli stessi. Allora, le euristiche che noi tutti usiamo, essendo guidati anche dal sistema 1, in alcuni casi ci portano a buoni risultati, in altri casi ci portano a errori. No? E quando le euristiche ci portano ad errori è perché si trasformano in biases. Questa, in 2 parole, è la tesi di Kahneman. Ora, scusate, forse sto prendendo troppo tempo, procedo rapidamente a parlare di nudge. Thaler e Sunstein basano la propria idea di nudge su questo tipo di ricerca empirica, no? Su questi studi comportamentali che fanno leva su esperimenti come quelli che vi ho mostrato e tanti altri, per cui si dice noi siamo affetti da forme di irrazionalità, o se lo vogliamo dire in un modo un po' più dolce, abbiamo una razionalità limitata, facciamo spesso errori, alcuni dei quali possono essere estremamente dannosi per la nostra vita o per la nostra, diciamo, prosperità. Come consumatori facciamo spesso errori, siamo manipolabili, siamo indotti a fare scelte di acquisto, scelte economiche che in realtà non ci beneficiano, e questo è perché siamo vittime di strategie pubblicitarie, di varie forme di nudging usate da soggetti privati, che sono i soggetti che operano sul mercato, e l'approccio comportamentale mette in luce queste cose e ci aiuta a capire queste dinamiche. Il nudge è una risposta il nudge pubblico, perché non parliamo qui di nudge privati, è una risposta a questo genere di problemi, nel senso che le strategie di nudging aiutano le persone a non commettere gli errori a cui facevo riferimento. Quando è stato tradotto in italiano il libro di Thaler e Sunstein, ci si è chiesti come tradurre nudge. Alla fine la cosa migliore è probabilmente lasciare la parola inglese, perché le traduzioni italiane non sono felici, come vi ho mostrato lì, ce ne sono alcune che sono davvero poco felici. Spintarella soprattutto è molto infelice. Allora, quali sono alcuni dei fallimenti che Sunstein in particolare chiama fallimenti comportamentali, cioè i fallimenti del mercato comportamentali generati dalle nostre inclinazioni tipiche del sistema 1, dai nostri biases. Sunstein dice, ad esempio, tendiamo a preferire il presente, tendiamo a dare poca importanza a eventi futuri che in realtà sono importanti, e abbiamo spesso in connessione a questo problemi di autocontrollo. Tipici esempi, le persone che hanno una qualche dipendenza da tabacco, alcol o altre sostanze, le persone che abusano di cibi di qualche tipo, le persone che in qualche modo preferiscono la soddisfazione presente derivante, che so, da tabacco, cibo, alcol, all'idea che alla lunga questa dipendenza mi rovinerà. Queste persone manifestano una qualche distorsione cognitiva, una qualche forma di razionalità nella misura in cui non si rendono conto dei danni futuri che la soddisfazione presente avrà. Da irrazionale, nella prospettiva del medio-lungo periodo, preferire la soddisfazione presente comparata, diciamo, ai danni significativi che nel lungo periodo una certa abitudine dà. Questo si lega anche a problemi di autocontrollo, nel senso che anche la persona che razionalmente capisce che fumare alla lunga danneggia, quindi anche la persona che con il proprio sistema 2 coglie i costi di questa attività, non riesce poi in molti casi a smettere di fumare, bere, quello che è, per problemi di autocontrollo. E qui di nuovo abbiamo, diciamo, una forma di razionalità. Questo è un problema molto discusso su cui non mi soffermo. Secondo punto, l'ignoranza degli attributi velati è, secondo Sunstein, quella caratteristica che noi abbiamo di puntare la nostra attenzione ad alcuni aspetti che ci catturano, che catturano il nostro sistema 1, tendendo a trascurare aspetti altrettanto significativi, importanti, che però non sono così appariscenti. Esempio che Sunstein fa: quando acquistate una macchina, guardate un'automobile, guardate, non lo so, alle prestazioni dell'auto, allo stile dell'automobile, se esteticamente vi piace o no, questo genere di cose. Naturalmente guardiamo anche al prezzo e guardiamo meno ai consumi dell'auto. E difficilmente facciamo dei calcoli su quello che ci costerà nel tempo avere una macchina piuttosto che un'altra, o di quello che costerà alla comunità il fatto che ci siano tante auto di un certo tipo piuttosto che di un altro in circolazione. I consumi nel lungo periodo e i costi che certe automobili hanno nel lungo periodo sono attributi velati, li chiama Sunstein, che vediamo meno rispetto allo stile dell'auto, alle prestazioni o a cose che ci catturano immediatamente. E ignorare attributi velati importanti è di nuovo una forma di irrazionalità. Ottimismo irrealistico. Siamo, in molti casi, non tutti, ma siamo spesso esageratamente ottimisti su certe cose. Ci sono studi comportamentali secondo cui si mostra che i guidatori, per tornare all'esempio delle automobili, normalmente sovrastimano le proprie capacità. No, beh, certo, io guido in maniera assolutamente migliore della media degli altri automobilisti, sì, insomma, e dato questo ho una minore probabilità di fare certi incidenti piuttosto che altri. Oppure un esempio che fanno spesso questi studiosi è il numero dei matrimoni che finiscono male, con le separazioni, dei divorzi. Dicono, perché le persone sono così ottimiste, no? Quando si sposano dicono, questa è la persona adatta per la mia vita intera, e poi dopo un po' ci si accorge che non è così. Questa è una forma di, anche questa dicono, di razionalità o razionalità limitata, che dipenderebbe da una overconfidence che abbiamo su certe cose, no? Poi i problemi con la probabilità. Non siamo bravi a calcolare le probabilità, non ce la facciamo. Cioè come umani caratterizzati da S1, non siamo bravi. Le macchine sono estremamente più efficaci di noi nel calcolare le probabilità. Allora, tutto ciò porta a errori seri, profondamente radicati nel funzionamento del sistema 1, il che ci impedisce in molti casi di promuovere i nostri fini. Come fare? Allora, Thaler e Sunstein dicono, abbiamo delle strategie di nudging che ci aiutano. Perché? Perché con il nudging abbiamo una cosa meravigliosa, che è il cosiddetto paternalismo libertario. Cioè, soprattutto Sunstein lo chiama in questo modo. Quando tu riesci a indurre una certa persona a fare quello che è meglio per lei, senza comprimerne la libertà di scelta, e qui torniamo alla definizione che prima abbiamo visto, abbiamo un effetto che è di paternalismo libertario, nel senso che non abbiamo compresso la libertà della persona, ma l'abbiamo indotta paternalisticamente a fare la cosa migliore. E questo è bene. È bene perché non obblighiamo le persone, non abbiamo dei vincoli, diciamo, all'azione, non abbiamo delle restrizioni della libertà, ma abbiamo i buoni risultati che vorremmo avere. Esempi. Noi potremmo anche bandire il tabacco, potremmo vietare tutti i prodotti come sigarette, sigari, eccetera, eccetera. Questo sarebbe un intervento hard, diciamo dal punto di vista giuridico, che bandisce un certo prodotto. Come proviamo a disincentivare le persone? Economicamente possiamo farlo aumentando tantissimo il prezzo delle sigarette. Oppure con una tecnica di nudge possiamo indurle a fumare meno. E cosa facciamo? Mettiamo le immagini scioccanti che colpiscono il sistema 1 sui pacchetti, mettiamo le scritte, fumare produce danni, bla bla bla. Poi quanto efficaci siano queste cose non si sa esattamente, però l'idea è cercare di indurre le persone a fare la cosa migliore per loro, senza restringerne la libertà. Con forme di nudging che hanno effetti perché noi siamo umani, dice Sunstein. E i nudges funzionano sfruttando il sistema S1. Le immagini forti sui pacchetti di sigarette colpiscono non S2, ma colpiscono S1. E le persone che smettono di fumare o non iniziano a fumare per questo, lo fanno più che altro in base a reazioni del sistema S1 piuttosto che del sistema S2. E quindi il nudging, se funziona, è un rimedio contro distorsioni ed errori sistematici. Esempio della direzione di organi, già stato toccato dalla professoressa Russo, quindi non sto a riprenderlo. Ci sono varie opzioni per aumentare la donazione di organi. Ci sono due possibili regole di default, cioè quella del consenso esplicito, del consenso presunto, opt-in, opt-out, non lo discuto perché ne abbiamo già parlato. Sunstein dice, notate che ogni nostra scelta avviene in quella che lui chiama l'architettura delle scelte. Cioè quando i critici del nudge dicono ma qui stai manipolando le persone, qui induci le persone a fare certe scelte piuttosto che altre, lui dice una qualche architettura delle scelte c'è comunque, perché noi non compiamo scelte nel vuoto, cioè noi compiamo scelte hic et nunc, dove siamo nei contesti in cui le cose stanno in un certo modo già, ok? Quindi se una qualche architettura delle scelte ci deve essere, meglio che sia un'architettura che induce le persone a fare la migliore scelta senza restringere la libertà. E qui sono importanti le regole di default, l'esempio della donazione di organi è uno, un altro esempio diciamo, poco importante che Sunstein fa, ma esemplificativo di questo, è quello di una stampante. Se voi volete risparmiare carta, mettete come regola di default nelle stampanti che stampino fronte e retro. Dopodiché, se qualcuno vuole una stampa solo su una facciata, vabbè, disattiva l'opzione di default e fa l'altra. Se però abbiamo l'opzione di default, che è quella più virtuosa, tanto meglio, perché le persone tendenzialmente seguono il default. Okay? Menu, importanza del modo in cui le cose sono presentate. Se voi in un menu partite dai cibi più sani, le persone tendenzialmente prenderanno quelli, anche se potrebbero prendere quelli più pesanti, pieni di grassi, eccetera, che stanno alla fine della lista. Però, visto che si parte con certe cose, un certo numero di soggetti prenderanno le prime e magari, se quelle sono le più salutari, questo sarà benefico. Quindi una qualche architettura è inevitabile, dobbiamo trovare quella buona. L'architettura delle scelte è inevitabile, questo lo dicevo. Ricordiamo che almeno negli intenti di Sunstein e Thaler, tutto ciò va a beneficio degli individui, che sono i nudged. Gli architetti delle scelte sono i nudger, sono coloro che definiscono l'architettura delle scelte in modo da fare paternalisticamente il bene dei nudged. Ok? E ovviamente, anche questo lo diceva prima Deborah, ciò solleva una perplessità, cioè perché anche i nudger, che nei tipici esempi di Sunstein sono gli amministratori, diciamo, no? Le agenzie amministrative, ad esempio del governo americano, i funzionari che si occupano di certi funzionari statali che si occupano di certe questioni, anche questi possono sbagliare. Dunque dobbiamo ricordarci che sono umani a propria volta, hanno un sistema 1 che potrebbe indurli in errori. Quindi è importante che comunque ci siano controlli sulle strategie di nudging e ci sia una discussione pubblica su queste cose. Finisco brevemente con alcuni spunti sull'applicazione del nudge al diritto internazionale, poi lascio la parola a Jean, mi scuso se sto prendendo troppo tempo. Ci sono alcuni aspetti positivi che mi fanno pensare a un'utile applicazione di queste tecniche al diritto internazionale. Uno, banalmente, la necessità di ottimizzare tempi e risorse. Il ruolo delle regole di default mi sembra importante in questo senso. Credo che non occorrano commenti su questo. Necessità di persuadere gli attori internazionali a sottoscrivere certi impegni o rispettarli adeguatamente. Se riusciamo a indurre gli attori internazionali a certi impegni che hanno conseguenze positive, benefiche per loro stessi o per l'intera comunità internazionale, riusciamo a indurli a sottoscrivere questi impegni o rispettare adeguatamente con quelle tecniche di nudging di cui si diceva prima, bene, cosa c'è di male in fondo, no? Oltretutto questo verrebbe a vantaggio diciamo della comunità internazionale nella misura in cui, come sappiamo, nel diritto internazionale il ruolo della coercizione è limitato. Così come è limitato in qualche modo l'impatto delle sanzioni economiche. Le sanzioni economiche, ricordate, non attaccano il sistema 1, le sanzioni economiche funzionano col sistema 2, perché il sistema 2 degli individui è quello che calcola i costi e i benefici. L'analisi costi-benefici non la fa il sistema 1, la fa il sistema 2. Quindi uno Stato, diciamo, che è soggetto a sanzioni economiche o a possibili sanzioni economiche, calcola i costi-benefici delle linee di azione che gli si prospettano, ok? Quindi quando voi imponete delle sanzioni economiche, se lo Stato è un attore razionale, calcola con il sistema 2, per così dire, quello che succederà. Se però volete usare tecniche di nudging, dovete fare delle altre cose, dovete agire su altri aspetti e questo può essere utile quando ci rendiamo conto che le sanzioni economiche hanno un impatto limitato. Però ci sono dei problemi e su questo credo che anche Jean si soffermerà. Primo, ma noi possiamo pensare agli stati come soggetti affetti da razionalità limitata o addirittura da irrazionalità? Io non lo so, a me questa cosa suona un po' strana. È un punto su cui bisognerebbe ragionare, credo. E poi le organizzazioni internazionali come andrebbero caratterizzate? Sono dotate di maggiore razionalità rispetto ai singoli agenti come i singoli stati? Boh, forse sì, idealmente è così, ma francamente non saprei dare una risposta netta a questa domanda. E quello che mi sembra importante è che in questo contesto c'è una ridotta simmetria fra nudger e nudged. Ricordiamo che nell'ambito di cui si parlava prima, negli esempi che Sunstein tipicamente dà, il nudger è un funzionario che ha una serie di conoscenze e di competenze superiori al nudged, che è il cittadino comune. Okay? Allora, in ambito internazionale cosa abbiamo? I nudger come organizzazioni internazionali che hanno più competenze e conoscenze degli stati, e gli stati sono i nudged. Boh. Non c'è quella relazione verticale che c'è ad esempio fra amministrazione e cittadini, mi sembra. E questo fa dubitare di un'utile applicazione. Non voglio essere scettico, ma voglio dire, ci sono questi problemi. I fallimenti comportamentali che Sunstein discute nell'ambito dei suoi esempi, forse in una certa misura si possono trovare anche in ambito internazionale, ma ci vogliono delle cautele. Ad esempio, preferenza per il presente, problemi di autocontrollo, ricordate il problema del fumo, queste cose qua. C'è nell'ambito internazionale? Qui si potrebbe dire sì, nella misura in cui gli stati non adottano misure efficienti contro il cambiamento, contro diciamo, i problemi del cambiamento climatico, mostra che hanno una preferenza per il presente, sono biased, nel senso che guardano all'utilità presente senza considerare tutta la disutilità futura di certe condotte. E quindi in questo senso forse qui c'è un problema di razionalità limitata degli stati che potrebbe essere corretto da forme di nudging, punto interrogativo. Ignoranza di attributi velati. Forse questo succede quando ci sono decisioni che puntano la propria attenzione su qualche aspetto di una questione e ne trascurano altre. Mi viene l'esempio in mente di Brexit, ma forse se ne possono fare altri. Oppure tutte le volte in cui c'è una negoziazione che si protrae per troppo tempo, con dei costi transattivi che diventano esorbitanti, qui forse c'è un problema consistente nel fatto che i negoziatori non calcolano i costi transattivi, cioè i costi del protrarsi di una negoziazione, che in quanto tale ha dei costi, forse. Ottimismo irrealistico, ricordate l'esempio dei guidatori, l'esempio di coloro che si sposano pensando sì, questa è la persona migliore per la mia vita, poi non è così. Possibili esempi, la guerra delle Falkland o Malvinas. Gli argentini a quanto pare insomma, si sono imbarcati in questa impresa con delle prospettive di successo che sono state smentite piuttosto rapidamente. Invasione russa dell'Ucraina, chi lo sa, vedremo. E in generale si potrebbe anche ragionare su questo, cioè se anche gli stati, gli attori internazionali abbiano dei problemi nello stimare le probabilità e i rischi di certe condotte. Questo è strano, a me suona strano, nel senso che noi come individui abbiamo dei problemi con la probabilità, ma che ce li abbia anche un'organizzazione, per di più un'organizzazione statale, mi sembra strano. Concludo, no, non concludo perché è successo qualcosa, non so cosa. Concludo con una citazione. Molti psicologi, chi si occupa di psicologia e discute poi di nudging, dice attenzione, questo in realtà è vecchio vino, per così dire, nuove botti, cioè sono vecchie cose che sappiamo da sempre presentate in una maniera nuova. Qui vi do una citazione in cui una certa cosa, che è X, poi vi dirò per cosa sta la X, viene definita così. Appare come una fornitrice di strumenti, una fabbrica di armi, una zecca per monete per operare sull'assentimento, per vincerlo, per comprarlo. Essa non impone fini, non si occupa di valori, non tratta di doveri. È insomma una guida onesta che ci dice qual è la strada più breve, qual è la più lunga, dove si trovano i fossi e le barriere, quali sono gli alberghi di primo ordine e quali malfamati, ma non si impone né vi consiglia piuttosto quelli che questi. Cos'è? È la strategia del nudging? È quella che nel 1907 Giuseppe Prezzolini chiamava l'arte della persuasione. Molti psicologi che si occupano di queste cose dicono che il nudging in sostanza è una forma di persuasione. Una forma di persuasione operata su quello che, se vogliamo, possiamo chiamare S1, sistema 1, al fine di indurre le persone a fare certe scelte facendo loro credere che le fanno liberamente, quando in realtà non è così. Mi fermo qui, vi ringrazio, mi scuso se ho preso troppo tempo.
passare. Ok, grazie mille Giovanni, veramente una relazione molto, scusate mi tolgo la mascherina altrimenti forse si sente anche male, una relazione che è molto interessante anche per comprendere proprio il funzionamento di questa scienza comportamentale, questa economia comportamentale che per noi è un po' estranea, diciamo, dal nostro ambito di studio. È veramente interessante. A me, devo dire la verità, una cosa che non torna, e lascio questa cosa, questo elemento, diciamo, per la discussione, una cosa che non torna tanto è perché si debbano considerare come errori, cioè queste imperfezioni comportamentali forse non sono imperfezioni, cioè forse è sbagliato l'assunto, cioè credere che l'essere umano sia un soggetto razionale, ma l'essere umano non è solo un soggetto razionale, ci sono delle spinte di tipo emotivo, per cui magari una persona può preferire, non so, seguire l'onda emotiva del momento piuttosto che evitare il rischio del fallimento di un matrimonio, faccio per dire. Può essere semplicemente l'espressione della sua più profonda essenza e volontà, quella di seguire qualcosa che non si può definire come razionale, ma l'essere umano non è necessariamente solo un essere razionale, sarebbe anche riduttivo pensarlo come tale. Quindi ecco, io mi chiedo se proprio l'assunto del nudge non sia in qualche modo insomma discutibile, ecco, in questo senso. Però prima di andare... So, well, it's now time to leave the floor to Professor Jean Daspromont. I'm very honored to give him the floor and to have the opportunity to hear from him some thoughts on nudge and international law. So thank you, Jean. The floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Deborah, distinguished chairperson. Well, let me start by saying that I'm obviously extremely grateful to the Italian Society for International Law and European Law for having me here. Special thanks to Pasquale De Sena, as well as Giovanni Zara. It's a great privilege to be addressing your distinguished society. I'm also very grateful to our colleague Pepe Ragoni for hosting us so nicely, and of course my gratitude goes to the University of Macerata as well. Much has been said about nudging and behavioral studies of law already by my dear colleagues. For my part, I'll just try to add a little bit to all what you've heard already, and I'll make three sets of observation. There'll be first definitional observations. I'll come back a little bit to what we mean by nudging in international law, and I'll add some concrete examples to those already provided by my colleagues. So definitional observation first, then I'll add some conceptual observations on how to frame, how to conceptualize nudging, and especially in terms of soft law. So I'll come back to the notion of soft law with these conceptual observations. Last but not least, I'll make some epistemological observation, and I'll come back to this debate about the behavioral turn in international law, the behavioral study of international law. So three sets of observation, and that is what will keep me and you busy for let's say 25 minutes. So definition observation, conceptual observation, and then epistemological observation. So starting with some definitional remarks about nudging. I mean, I don't need to dwell upon this because my colleagues, Deborah, Russo, and Giovanni Tuzet have already, I think, extensively introduced the concept. By now, you all know that nudges are regulatory tools that use psychological insights to create a decision-making environment where only certain choices are possible. So it's all about creating a decision-making space where some choices are possible and other are not. So it's you direct, but this is while still preserving the choice. So it's directing, but choice preserving, and you got that from the wonderful introductions by my colleague. So we are speaking about behaviorally informed regulations. So it's a sort of governmental smart thinking, as some colleagues put it. And I think there's a bit of echo here. Shall we maybe switch this on? No, it's on. Okay. Is it better? So for lawyers, and this is, and I guess the sounds would be all right now. For lawyers, this is something intriguing because it is no longer the plain ban, the plain prescriptions, the plain prohibitions. No, we have some sort of decision-making space where some choices are possible. Let's try the other side. Yeah. So for us, very intriguing. No plain prohibition, no plain prescriptions, choice-inducing space. Well, so this is all familiar to you by now. Well, we are saying that nudging is becoming international. That's what we have been told. Nudging was used by domestic agencies and governments for a long time, but now nudging is reaching international law. And apparently, we are told, when I say we, I mean the literature, we are told that nudges now populate international treaties. And I think very concrete examples have been provided by Deborah earlier. We also told that international organizations now have created behavioral units. For instance, there is now a United Nations Behavioral Initiative. There is a World Health Organization technical advisory group on behavior. I think the World Bank also has some behavioral units to advise them in their decision-making processes. So behavior and nudging are coming to international law, and that's why I think it is to the credit of this society to have made nudging the topic of this conference. Well, nudging is coming to international law. I think Deborah provided some example. Let me, for the sake of discussion, provide some extra examples. I mean, one concrete example of these nudges is found in this behaviorally informed disclosure of information. You will only disclose certain type of information to international actors. In climate change law, this is very common. Scientific reports are carefully shared. They are disclosed according to some strategic thinking. Not all the information is disclosed. Some information is disclosed at a certain time. The timing of the disclosure of information is thought through. That's a concrete example of nudging in climate change law. We've mentioned that already, the opting out clauses, the opt-out options that are found in certain treaties, especially when it comes to dispute settlement mechanism, is another example of nudging. Goal setting, the UN Millennium Development Goals were mentioned. The Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degree extra max is another one. The target of the Kyoto Protocol, and so on and so on. It's another type of nudging. Another common nudge is the setting of deadlines for negotiations, or deadlines for the renewal of a regime, like the Kyoto Protocol was meant to, or there was a deadline, there was a timeline set in the Kyoto Protocol. A last one, very well known, is the ranking. It was mentioned already. The World Bank, for instance, uses a lot of ranking mechanisms. It constantly, regularly produces these doing business reports, whereby it measures the friendliness of the state regulatory environments, and so ranks the states. So all these are concrete examples of of nudging. Is that all new? Is this a new phenomenon? Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure it's really new. I mean, nudging states into certain kind of behavior short of any prohibition or any ban or any prescription is something we've been witnessing in international law for quite some time. Just think about the good old framework conventions. Framework conventions could be deemed to be construed as a nudging example. Or think about these treaties that are where the scope is defined by states. Take the Convention on the Protection of National Minorities, where states define themselves what a national minority is. Couldn't that be deemed a sort of nudging? Take the hundreds of treaties where states, there are 300, I think, where states can opt out of the jurisdiction of the ICJ. These treaties have been around for decades. And take even reservations to treaties. Isn't that a good old mechanism that actually provides this decision-making space as all nudges mechanism? So, not to mention goal setting. Goal setting have been found in treaties for decades. So, I just want to invite you to question a little bit the novelty of all this. Maybe this is something international lawyers have been confronted with for decades. It's just only now that our attention is turning to these mechanisms, possibly under the influence of psychology studies and other disciplines, as was mentioned earlier. But it may not necessarily be something truly new. That being said, it's not because it may have been with us for quite some time that we can't study it. I think, on the contrary, again, I think it's very valuable that this society has put nudging on the agenda of its work, and I want to again pay tribute to the management board of the society for turning our attention to nudging. So these were my first set of observations. Nudging in international legal practice. What do we mean? Is that really new? Well, I think by now you're very familiar with the phenomenon. So I turn to my second set of remarks, which are more of a conceptual character, and I turn to this question of soft law, which has been put forward by the organizers and which has already been insightfully dealt with by Deborah. Well, is this soft law, or what's the relationship between nudging and soft law, or is soft law a useful concept to theorize and apprehend nudging? Well, before I try to provide some elements, let me just make a very simple finding. So all these nudging tools we've mentioned, the ranking, the deadlines, the opting out clauses, and so on. Well, some of them, and this is extremely basic what I'm going to say, some of them are found in legally binding instruments, and some others are found in non-legally binding instruments. So, for instance, the goals of 1.5 degree extra set in the Paris Convention is found in a legally binding instrument. ICJ opting out clauses are found in legally binding instruments. On the contrary, the UN Millennium Development Goals or the World Bank ranking, they do not take the form of a legally binding instrument. Yeah, so that's just a plain, very plain descriptive observation. So, is this soft law? Well, before I share some elements with you, let maybe first elucidate a little bit what we mean by soft law. And I mean, don't worry, I'm not going to give you a lesson, but I think originally the concept of soft law, it was coined by our English colleague McNair in the 1950s to refer to lex ferenda. the law to be, or the desired law. Well, in the literature, the concept of soft law received a slightly different twist. Now in the literature, English literature, Italian literature, French literature, it means two different things. It doesn't mean lex ferenda anymore, as it was in McNair's work. It means two different things. It means soft law as a soft instrument. It is a soft instrumentum. It is an instrument is soft because it's not legally binding. That's one meaning of soft law. Another meaning of soft law is soft law as soft content. It is when the legally binding instrument is not norm creating. It doesn't prescribe anything, but it's nonetheless legally binding. So sometimes you have soft law in the form of soft instruments, and sometimes you have soft law in the forms of a soft content. So the example of the soft instrument, indeed, is the UN Millennium Goal, the ranking of the World Bank, whereas the settings for instance, the goal set in the Paris Convention on climate change, this is soft law as soft content, because there is no obligation, it's a goal. So two types of soft law, soft instrument or soft content. Well, are the nudging tools any of these two types of soft law? Well, yeah, I believe they are. And I don't think this is controversial. As I said, the UN Millennium Goals, the ranking of the World Bank, well, they are found in instruments which are soft as instruments, whereas others are found in legally binding instruments. So not very controversial, and I wonder what there is to be said. Yes, nudges instruments are found in non-legally binding instruments, and others are found in legally binding instruments which have a more soft content. So I don't think we need to discuss this any further. What more interesting, in my view, is why do we raise the question of soft law in the first place? Why do we feel? Because it's a question that comes naturally to me, but why do we feel this way? Why we as lawyers, we believe that it's natural to first ask the question whether nudging or these nudges are soft law. It's true that to lawyers, and especially to international lawyers, thinking in terms of sources is the natural way to apprehend the world and to apprehend regulatory phenomena. You open your eyes in the morning and you start coding the world in terms of sources of international law. So you observe a new phenomenon, or not so new phenomenon like nudging, and you immediately, as a lawyer, raises the question of the sources. And if the phenomenon doesn't fit in the traditional sources, then you come with soft law, which is this sort of fishing rod to catch all what is not caught by the net of the traditional sources. That's just a normal move by a lawyer. It's a normal move, but I'm still a bit puzzled by that move that we all make, and I include myself in that move. I've spent 15 years of my career studying the sources. Well, why do we make that move? We witness the phenomenon of nudging. Why do we need to feel a need to capture it in terms of sources of law or soft law? Well, I think we shouldn't do this. And let alone in terms of soft law. And here I'll be a bit polemical, but I'm sure the organizers anticipated it a bit when inviting me. But I really think that the concept of soft law is a rubbish concept. It says nothing. If a legally binding instrument has a soft content, well, it is not norm creative. Full stop. Why do we need to call it soft law? It's not norm creative. And if an instrument is not legally binding, basically it's not legally binding, it's not law. So why do we need to call on this concept of on soft law? I don't think it says anything. I don't think when you say something is soft law, I don't think you've said anything, or at least anything useful. Some texts are norm creating, some texts are not legally binding, some texts are not norm creating, neither norm creating nor legally binding. That's it. So the descriptive and explanatory value of soft law is in my view, very, very poor. I think, and here I'm moving more into how I see nudges, but again, I'm going to say a very elementary thing. Law works around text, and texts do not need soft law to we don't need soft law to explain the functioning of text. Law is a hugely textual universe where text refers to text, where text differ meaning to other text, and they do so. Text refer to other text differ meaning to other text, irrespective of whether these texts are soft law or hard law. Text refer to text, full stop. And some texts are legally binding, some other texts are norm created, others are not, or less. If the ICJ referred to a General Assembly resolution, it refers to a General Assembly resolution, full stop. Why do we need to call it soft law to explain the ICJ referring to a General Assembly resolution? So you knew I would say that, but I still say it. It's just, I think soft law isn't helpful. It hardly explains anything. And so I prefer to see nudges, to come back to the topic of this conference, I prefer to see nudging as textual engineering. Nudging is textual technology. That's what it is. Through nudging, we are trying to optimize the way in which texts govern the world. The world is governed by text, by ranking, by deadlines, by notions, by goals. Well, that's textual engineering, that's textual technology. And I don't think we need soft law. I think it's much more interesting to look at this from the standpoint of textuality rather than soft law. So this is the end of my second set of observations, the conceptual observation. And as possibly the organizers could anticipate, I couldn't help trashing again the concept of soft law, which I find unhelpful. I think it's much more interesting to see all this from the standpoint of textuality or textual technology. So I now move to my third set of observation, which are more of an epistemological character, and coming back to what Giovanni was speaking about, which is this behavioral studies of law that we've seen flourishing in the last decade. Many of our colleagues, so I don't need to return to genealogy of the behavioral study of law. I think Giovanni introduced us to it very, very clearly and extensively. What I want to say is that possibly many colleagues would say it's more interesting to study nudging from the standpoint of behavioral studies rather than the sources of international law or soft law. So maybe you could think that the consequence of me trashing soft law is that I invite you to look at nudging from the perspective of the behavioral study of law. Well, that's at least what many colleagues of ours are now saying. Many international lawyers have embraced these days the study of the behavioral study of law, and they even claim that nudging, soft law, everything should be studied from the standpoint of behavior, using cognitive biases as they've been theorized in psychology and behavioral studies. I mean, our colleagues, Anne Van Aken, for instance, or Tome Browdy have been writing about behavioral study of international law for almost 15 years. Our colleagues Takeman and Zamir were mentioned by Deborah earlier. They've also been producing important studies about behavior in international law. And this is not new. There was the first symposium on the behavioral study of international law was held on Opinio Juris as early as 2013, so almost 10 years ago. Recently, a major study has been compiled by Harlan Cohen and Tim Meyer in the US. They've produced a book on international law as behavior last year. There was on the American Journal of International Law, Unbound, there was a symposium on the behavioral turn in international law, because now it's called, it has become so popular in international law that international lawyers have come to speak about the behavioral turn. International lawyers love to speak in terms of terms. There was the turn to the linguistic turn 30 years ago with the rise of critical legal studies. There was the turn to history 20 years ago with the renewed interest in the history of international law. There was the empirical turn 10 years ago with the use of quantitative data in international law. Now we have the behavioral turn. And so the embrace of behavioral studies of law. Well, we know where this comes from. This did not happen in a vacuum. I think Giovanni has already wonderfully spelled out the background in which the behavioral turn occurred in international law. And so building on a long tradition in anthropology, economics, sociology. I mean, our friends from international relations have long been studying behavior. So I don't need to come back to that. What I want to note rather is that in international law, the rise of behavioral study, the rise of the behavioral study of law has come as a critique of the use of rational choice theory. So some of our colleagues, especially in the US, have been extensively using rationalist approaches to international law, Andrew Guzman, Joel Trackman, Alan Sykes, or Eric Posner. And the behavioral studies of international law are meant to displace these rational choice theories inherited from economics. So in a way, there is a critical dimension to the turn to behavior, to the behavioral turn in international law, because it is meant to contest and to question the use of rational choice theory that had been promoted by some of our colleagues. And so that's how I see the turn to behavior, the behavioral turn in international law, as a critique of rational choice theory. So it's flourishing today. I've mentioned the names and works of many colleagues who are now working and promoting such an approach, the use of cognitive biases in the study of law. What do I think of this? So how do I take this behavioral turn? And do I think that it's a better way to study nudges? Should we actually study nudges from the standpoint of behavior? Again, I believe this could be anticipated, but I'm afraid I'm not so thrilled by the behavioral study of international law. I think the behavioral study of international law suffer from some very severe normative and methodological limitations. And here, actually, with a view to feed the discussion, I'd like to mention 5 reasons why I am extremely reserved towards this much celebrated behavioral study of international law. So I want to raise 5 charges, or 5 objections, and I want to show you why, even if I think interdisciplinarity is a great thing and should be promoted, and I do think lawyers should always read beyond their field, I nonetheless believe that one has to be very careful and possibly suspicious towards the behavioral approaches to international law. And so let me mention 5 reasons why I think we have to be extremely careful. Even if, once again, I can only invite you just to read beyond the discipline and not to stick to the law journals. There's so much more interesting stuff out there. But when you venture into interdisciplinarity, you have to do it with the greatest care. And so I'm raising 5 objections which are not meant to invalidate the behavioral study of international law. Who am I to make claim of validity about approaches? But it's just an invitation for especially our young colleagues to be careful when they venture into interdisciplinarity. A first objection, or first reason for care, or is a first charge, is again this. It's something. It's an old stuff. It's an old move. It's this anthropomorphic move that we have witnessed already, but which really informs the behavioral study of international law. When these studies put the emphasis on the behavior of states, of international organizations, or collective actors, they actually embrace what I feel is a form of naive anthropomorphism, because it rests on the projection of human behavior on corporate actors. They attribute an intellect, a human intellect, to corporate actors. They presume that these actors have human intellect and operates like human being. In international law, of course, this is no new construction. In the very old theorization of international law, found in Suarez, Hobbes, Pufendorf, Wolff, and obviously Vattel, there's long been a presumption that the state is endowed with an intellect, an intellect that is distinct from the intellect of the sovereign. So anthropomorphism or anthropomorphist thinking is not new, and it still dominates certain constructions we are taught in law school. Take the very idea of opinio juris in the doctrine of customary international law, that's highly anthropomorphic, and the idea that the state has beliefs. The state is like us, the state dreams, the state desires, the state believes. This is some good old anthropomorphism that we still mobilize in our everyday practice of international law. So it's been with us, but here with the behavioral studies of international law, I think anthropomorphism is maximized. It's coming to a head. It becomes the central point of entry into the study of international law, and I find this highly problematic and very limiting. The usual charges against anthropomorphism and the projection of a human intellect on a corporate actor applies here full strength, full thrust. And so be careful with these sorts of anthropomorphist approach. First charge, first reason for reservation and care. The second, more serious, I think, it's a charge of essentialism. I think that the behavioral approaches to international law are highly essentialist. And what do I mean by that? Well, to explain what I mean by essentialism, I want to refer to what Hannah Arendt wrote in her Human Condition book in 1958. She wrote, "The trouble with modern theories of behavior is not that they are wrong, but that they could become true." Because actually, and so the charge is by Hannah Arendt is also a charge made famously by Michel Foucault, who for the first part of his career was really fighting the idea of human sciences or social sciences. And his idea, very common, it's very well known, is that social sciences and human sciences, they do not study the human. No, they create the human. So the human, or humanity, if you wish, is not out there in the world. It's created through the discourses and the sciences through which we study it. So you pretend you study the human, but actually you deploy tools, notions, and through which you actually constitute the human. And the famous last paragraph of The Order of Things by Foucault, when he calls for the death of the human, is actually a call for the end of human sciences and social sciences creating the human. Well, I think the same charge can be made against the behavioral study of international law. I think by focusing on patterns of human behaviors at work in states, in international organizations, and collective actors, I think these studies, they come to constitute a certain type of humanity. So they presume a certain human essence or an essential human behavior, which they project on the world, which they project on states, which they project on international organizations. And by virtue of these projections, they secure confirmation. of the essential human behavior. So they produce a certain idea of the human, they project it on the world, and they find confirmation of that essential humanity they have presumed. So they presuppose a certain type of human. Well, and again, I don't want to be too polemical here. So I think there is a great deal of essentialism in the behavioral study of international law. They presume a certain human, a certain type of human behavior, and I'm afraid, I think that the human that is presupposed in these studies is again the Western white male. So I think the patterns of behaviors that are presupposed and that informs behavioral studies of international law are patterns of behaviors of the male located in the West. And so it's not only essentialist, it's possibly neo-colonialist. And I think this is something international lawyers should be extremely careful about. And so whenever we are confronted with essentialist constructions, we really have to maneuver with the greatest form of care. So second charge, the charge of essentialism. A third charge, early on I wanted to call this innovationism. It's the obsession with innovation and the ever-growing complexity of the world. I think the behavioral turn in international law is really the illustration of this constant quest for new turns, for new methodologies, for new approaches, for new areas, for new phenomena, and so on and so on. It's really the manifestation of this unquenchable thirst for new complexities. It's possibly something in this part of the world we are less prone to, but that's something, for instance, that enormously and extensively dominates Anglo-Saxon legal thought. This quest for the constant innovation, the quest for new phenomena, the quest for new complexities. And I think, I think the behavioral studies of international law are just an expression of that. It's again a quest for new complexities. They seek to find new complexities, but we've been there. We know that the complexity of the world is a production of the discourse. And the more we complexify the discourse, the more we complexify the world. And I think that this constant, the behavioral studies of international law, they fall short of realizing that the new complexity they allegedly elucidate is constructed by the discourse, by their discourse. And it's also an approach that I think falls short of realizing that the quest for innovation is just a genre. It's a literary genre that dominates the legal literature, and so it's in a way it's very conservative because it's using the traditional literary style, literary genre that are already found in everywhere else in the literature. So that's the third charge. It is this obsession with innovation, obsession for new complexities. There is a fourth reason why I'm a bit reserved towards the behavioral studies of international law. It's because I feel it epitomizes a crave for relevance of lawyers. And when I read, and with a view to preparing this conference, I've spent 2 weeks reading all the literature on the behavioral study of international law, and I couldn't help feeling that it was an attempt by international lawyers to uphold their centrality in international decision-making processes. They want to be, it illustrates the dream of international lawyers, and especially international scholars, to be those experts in treaty design. They want to be the one. They want to be the social science, the social science expert informing the treaty makers. So it's no longer the dream of being cited by a court, which is the old dream of lawyers or international lawyers. Too bad for them, the ICJ doesn't cite scholarship. But that's the old dream being replaced now by the dream to be the social science expert in treaty design, in regulatory framework making. And I think if this is the goal, I'm not sure that, so first of all, I find this extremely navel-gazing. And second, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think that's something international lawyers should be concerned with, the loss of relevance or the craving for relevance in the making of text. I think this is an inappropriate concern. And yet, when I read behavioral studies of literature on the behavioral study of international law, I can't help thinking that we have here a group of professionals trying to uphold its centrality and its political importance as a professional group, as a group of experts. So, yeah, that's managerialism. It's the attempt of international lawyers to remain the managers of text. Well, finally, a last reason for care, and my final reason for being so reserved towards the behavioral study of international law, it's what I call the charge of scienticism, because when I read the literature on behavioral studies of international law, I see the newest and latest variant. Of course, variant is a fashionable word these days. It's the latest variant of the old scientist project for international law. It's the old project of a science of international law. So it can be read as an attempt to resuscitate the scientific study of international law. Or, let me say that I appreciate that in this country there's still a lot of attachment to the idea of a scientific study of international law. That's not the case in many other parts of the world, where the idea of a science of international law has collapsed and has even been repudiated. I read the behavioral study of international law as a new way to provide scientificity to the study of international law. It's about creating a new knowledge about international law. It's about creating new knowledge about the functioning of international law. It's about shedding light and elucidating what is real. It's all about creating a new knowledge of the real. So it really is. It is a scientistic project. It is a way to promote a more scientific study of international law, and in that sense, the behavioral study of international law shares a lot of kinship with the empirical turn, the empirical studies, or the scientific study of the history of international law, which we've seen on the rise and flourishing in the last year. I mean, scienticism has been repudiated in critical theory, but it is again on the rise in the international legal literature. And I think the behavioral study of international law is just an example of that. It's a manifestation of the return of scienticism in international legal thought. Well, I don't need to dwell upon this, and it might be about time to draw this to a close, but let me say that I find this scienticism, the scienticism that informed the behavioral study of international law, highly problematic for all the reasons we found problematic the idea of a science of international law. I mean, you know, it is a move. Why do we do this? Well, we do this because we live in societies when there are hierarchy of discourses. And especially since the Enlightenment, there is the discourses about the real. The discourses that speak about the real are hierarchically superior to the discourses that do not speak about the real. So what addresses the real, especially scientific discourses, are superior or have a discursive superiority compared to discourses about art, fiction, literature. And that's why, actually, at the end of the 19th centuries, international lawyers have tried to tap into this discursive hierarchy of discourses. And they've also tried to say, well, international law is a discourse about the real. We are scientific. The project for science of international law that consolidated at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was was a way to take advantage of this modern hierarchy of discourses. The lawyers too, the international lawyers too, wanted to be in the league of the good, superior discourses. Well, I think that our friends from behavioral studies of international law are doing just like this, tapping into the discursive superiority of discourses about the real. And they want to tell us, let's study international law so that we elucidate the real. Let's have a discourse about international law that is closer to the real, that produce knowledge about the real. This is just that. So we've been there. We've been there. And again, we have forgotten all the objections against the idea of a science of international law. I mean, the traditional objections, and they are well known to you, is that the science of international law, a scientific approach to international law is an approach that hides its own politics. It's an approach that hides its agenda, hidden morality. It provides a Western-centric humanity, a Western-centric geography. It promotes a capitalist ideology, all this under the guise of the objectivity of science. And so I find the project of science of international law, to which the behavioral studies of international law belong, something which can possibly be very, very dangerous, because you mobilize the discursive superiority of science to impose a certain ideology, very often a phallocentric and Western-centric ideology, all this under the name of science. And I think that the behavioral studies of international law cannot escape that the same criticism. And so that's why I think we have to be suspicious. Go and read that literature. It's highly interesting. I think Giovanni have shown you all the great stuff that can be found in that literature. I think it's highly formative. I think it is great that a learned society like this one is paying attention to this, but be suspicious. Be suspicious and do move into these territories with care, for the reasons that I've mentioned. I think it's about time I conclude, and to conclude, I want to return to nudging, nudging as a regulatory tool. As I said, I think it's a highly interesting phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that warrants the attention, even if it may not be an entirely new topic. But as I've tried to show today, neither soft law and the sources of international law, nor the behavioral study of law provides, in my view, a useful perspective to look at nudging. For me, there may be other ways in which we want to look at nudging, and I've tried today in my modest intervention to show the limitations of both soft law sources on the one hand and the behavioral studies of law on the other when it comes to studying nudging. My point has been that nudging is, and I've mentioned it, I repeat it, is textual technology. It's textual engineering, and hence I think the best ways to study it is to study it from the standpoint of textuality. And here I want to make that point, especially in front of all the young colleagues in the room, because I want to give them confidence. On the contrary, I think things like the behavioral studies of international law, they can really dent your confidence, because as a lawyer, you think that these other pseudo-scientists elsewhere are better placed to give you insights on the functioning of law. No, I believe that what matters is the text. The text is the starting point, and the lawyers are the masters of the text. They are the masters of the textual technologies, and so I think lawyers do not need. They need to read much more than what they read right now. They need to venture in other fields, in other disciplines. They need to go and read economics, philosophy, sociology, all that stuff. But we don't need this dubious collaboration with scientists to delve and study, or to delve into textual engineering and study our textual technology. I don't think we need to be concerned about our societal relevance. I think, and especially the young lawyers in the room, that they should trust their own craft in designing, in creating textual technology. I think we should trust our own ability to study textual technology. I think we have the tools. And again, I think the text is the starting point. There's nothing outside the text. We will always see the world through our text, and the lawyers are the masters of the text. Thank you for your attention.
So, thank you so much, Jean, for this enlightening, profound, and very original way to think about nudging and nudging in international law. And for this, claim to trust for young scholars, I think it's important to trust and to be skeptical about all that can be qualified as new or as scientific and resolutive for human well-being and happiness. Thank you very much. I want to open the discussion now, and I hope that there are some reactions from young scholars. If you want to share with us your thoughts, your doubts, your opinions, what do you think about nudging? Do you think? Well, yes, I see the first hand raised. We have a microphone. Yes, we have a microphone. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentations. Just a question, maybe going back to one point raised by... You're right, so sorry. My name is Alessandro Amoroso from Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa. I have a question that goes back to one of the points raised by Professor Russo at the beginning. It's the relation between nudging and autonomy, that it's particularly relevant with the autonomy of the individual, of course. But if you project these on the international law level, I was wondering if you see any problem of nudging with the principle of non-interference. I know, of course, that like to have interference, you need coercive means, but thinking especially of what you gave as a third example, so for example, rankings, and if rankings are established by an international organization and then they become the basis upon which, I don't know, funds are distributed or any other advantage is gained or disadvantages are decided, whether this then might infringe in a way the domestic affairs of the states and become an unlawful interference in their domain reserve. I'm sure maybe this goes very far. I don't know how far nudging can go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I don't know if it's better to collect some questions or if I can answer, or maybe I can answer and in the meantime others can think about questions and comments. Thanks for the question. So you asked me to clarify the concept of the intrusion, the risk of intrusion into domestic affairs implied in the use of rankings and benchmarks and standards. Well, I think the risk lies in the fact that when benchmarks and standards are established as conditions to get loans or to have benefits from international organizations, from the international cooperation, so from other states, I think there is a strong pressure on states to change their law, to change their policy, overstepping public opinion on the purpose of getting international assistance, getting funds, and so on. So I think this may be seen as a form of interference in domestic affairs, because in case of state defaults or risk of state defaults, states do not really have a choice. I mean, they formally have a choice, but in reality they are forced to change their law, to do reforms, and to conform to these standards that are claimed as the best standards for all. In this sense, I see a risk of intrusion in domestic affairs of states. I don't know if I managed to express my view. Okay. Sure. Sure. Where's the microphone? Thanks.
Thank you. That relates both to the ideological character pointed out by Jean, as far as the utilization, the use of behavioral point of view is concerned, and the basic reasons on the basis of which we have imagined this event. Well, I would like to point that some phenomena that are passed off as examples of nudging are not examples of nudging, insofar as they do not entail forms of kind pressure. As Deborah has just told us, I refer particularly to economic conditionality and health conditionality. And I guess that to point out that it's not useless, because of the fact that many scholars tend to qualify this phenomenon as examples of nudging. And this is not a neutral trend. This is not a neutral attitude. It's quite funny, because this trend amounts to something that is completely opposite to another traditional trend of international legal scholars. That is to say, to attempt to discover, to show something that could be defined as a legal binding effect, but that in fact is not a legal binding effect. It's completely opposite to this trend. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this clarification. And I see that also. I see there's also Professor Beatrice Bonafè wants to add something, so I'm gonna.
Deborah, just a very quick remark. I'm afraid we get trapped into this nudging trick. What I found very interesting, and I thank you for your presentation, I was totally ignorant about the matter, and for me it was really stimulating. But what I found interesting more
Beatrice, sorry, can you just put out your masks?
Perché non si sente? Sì? Okay. So more than finding examples of nudging in international law, and I totally agree with Jean, we're perfectly capable of judging ourselves or finding the examples ourselves. But what is really interesting for me is understanding this architecture, the way in which this environment can have an impact on the choice. The fact that states are lazy or would not make the declaration if required, better avoid opting in and or other options. So we know that. But the kind of environment that has an impact on the decision is, I think, extremely interesting, even for us. We can learn a lot knowing the mechanism that leads to putting the bigger figure before the other one or leading to a certain outcome. And I think there we can learn from each other. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Other questions? Yes, Giovanni?
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I totally agree with Gian on his analysis. And I would add something also in relation to what Giovanni said before. He said, I cannot see a state being irrational. Actually, I see states being irrational every day, to be honest. And just let us think about how Italy governed the COVID crisis. Every day, a new decree changing the conditions of our life. This is rational or irrational? For me, it's completely rational. But I would say, let's not confuse these kind of behaviors with an effect, necessarily an effect of nudging. I would say states are irrational because they are irrational, because there are a lot of elements, political, contextual, that can determine a certain behavior. And not necessarily we have to see in some phenomena more than what they are. Some manifestations of irrationality, full stop. But I'm completely in agreement with what Gian said. This is not a manifestation of law, and this is not something even close to law. It's just human behavior. I don't know what you think on this.
Thank you very much. Others? I have to say in the meantime that I think one of the among the charges that Jean has presented, the one that I think is well, in my view, is the most worrying is the charge of the conformative effects of nudging, both for human beings and for states. Because this is very, very sad, because there is a kind of claim of education, of educating individuals in order to avoid, like children, in order to avoid that they make mistakes, in order to guide them to make more rational choices. But then maybe instead of educating them, you are rendering them more passive, more less aware, less informed about, and less lucid and smart in judging about themselves and what is good for themselves. So I think also here there is a tricky. I don't know if it is effective, this strategy of nudging, even with this purpose of education. And the other problem is that this conformative effect risks to invalidate the essential, the very ontological nature of human beings and of states as well, like sort of creating an effect of uniformation of all, no? Forced uniformation and neutralization of diversity, which is instead a characteristic of humanity. The diversity is a basic characteristic of humanity. The diversity of states, the diversity of human beings. And so the impression is that this conformative effect of nudging risks to neutralize one essential characteristic of human beings and of the world in its own. So yes, I think this warning has really impressed me a lot. And other reactions or comments? Professor?
Sia compatibile con una società che si definisca liberale, o non lo ritiene affatto? Questo è poi il nocciolo della questione. Grazie.
Very interesting question. Is the question of the relationship between nudging and freedom, no? Also. Yes, I give you the...
Rispondo in italiano, sì. Ma se prendiamo per buona la definizione di nudge che danno i suoi sostenitori, per definizione è compatibile con uno Stato liberale nella misura in cui gli strumenti di nudge non comprimono la libertà degli individui, non escludono delle scelte come lecite, diciamo. È un esempio facile, lo uso per questo. Prendi il problema del fumo, diciamo, no? Supponiamo che siamo d'accordo sul fatto che si debba cercare di limitare il fumo e la dipendenza da tabacco, ok? Nel bene degli individui, nel bene della collettività nel suo insieme. Ora, come possiamo farlo? Uno strumento che sicuramente non è liberale è quello proibizionista, di bandire questi prodotti. Potremmo pensare che questa è una forma, diciamo, particolarmente efficace, perché questo, a parte il fatto di generare un possibile mercato nero, renderebbe, diciamo, non lecita questa opzione, quindi genererebbe l'effetto positivo, se la misura è applicata ovviamente, di non avere più i danni associati al fumo, ma con il costo di un sacrificio della libertà individuale di fumare. E l'esempio può essere moltiplicato per tante altre cose, come il consumo di alcol, il consumo di bevande zuccherate, tutto quello che volete. Questo ha un prezzo in termini di restrizione della libertà. L'altra opzione è quella di agire sugli incentivi economici, cioè mantieni libero il fumo, ma fai aumentare il costo dei tabacchi al punto che le persone cominciano a ridurre l'uso di questo bene. L'altra ipotesi è quella di usare strumenti di nudging come le campagne di sensibilizzazione contro il fumo, le immagini sui pacchetti, le scritte sui pacchetti, il che non incide sul costo del tabacco, quindi non è un disincentivo economico, non comprime la libertà degli individui, ma in qualche modo li spinge, agendo sul loro sistema 1, ad abbandonare questa abitudine o a non iniziare in questa abitudine. Quindi se gli esempi a cui possiamo pensare vanno in questa direzione, sono compatibili con uno Stato liberale, direi. La domanda è semmai quanto siano efficaci. Io non lo so, non ho dati su cui adesso posso rispondere su questo esempio specifico, cioè che io sappia, non abbiamo dati sull'effettività di queste misure di nudging, le scritte o le immagini sui pacchetti di sigarette, no? Quanto abbiano contribuito, quanto contribuiscono, quanto contribuiranno a ridurre il tasso di fumatori in un paese. E questo però è un altro problema. Sulla tua domanda direi che per definizione ci siamo, cioè sono strumenti compatibili con lo Stato liberale.